Glenn Thrush, take us through what, if any, interest Jack Smith's team has as they prepare for trial in Trump's ongoing statements. Is it sort of intelligence as to how he might defend himself? What is it?
I think it's a lot of things, and some of it could be used in evidence in the obstruction case, according to former department officials that I've spoken to in the last 24 hours. If all you have to do is look at the affidavit that was used to obtain the search warrant of Mar-a-Lago, and they used, in several instances, things that he said on TV, tweets that he made. I think there's a couple of Truth Social posts. So Donald Trump sort of performing in the public arena as a political player, and we've talked about this many times, is ill-serving him as a client. And I think you're absolutely right about his lawyers. How do you defend someone who insists on going into the public sphere and saying things that could potentially later be used against him at trial? Trump's larger calculation here is that the legal proceeding will be subsidiary to the political one, that by winning over his base and by powering through this from a set of political imperatives, that he will ultimately be able to overpower the legal system. That's the only conclusion one can really draw from watching the way that he's behaving right now.
Yeah, and I wonder, Glenn, I mean, his former chief of staff described him as scared, bleepless. He's done everything in his power to avoid this, to avoid being indicted criminally. He's sought to, everything he did that is detailed in the Mueller report second volume was to avoid this, to avoid criminal exposure, to avoid being charged with anything. Do you have any intel into how he's faring now, criminally indicted by the federal government he once ran?
Look, I think it's the way he has dealt with these things in the past, though I think the severity of this is considerably greater. You know, in talking with people who have communicated with him over the past week or so, he gets it on some level, and then he doesn't. It's very similar to the way that he dealt with everything in the White House. There are moments of clarity where he understands the gravity, and that's why you know, he's able to hire a legal team that's made up of some experienced people. But then he sort of rails against his, whom he perceives to be his attackers. But the one coherent strategy that he's going to employ is delay. He wants this thing to drag on as long as possible. That the point that you made about writing all these dates down in pencil is very apt. There's no way he's going to really see the inside of a courtroom in August. And I believe his hope, from talking to one of his allies today, is to really push these delays past the election.
Yeah. Mary McCord, let's talk about dates. As that news broke across the wire or social media, I joked that, you know, Expedia is exploding with planned vacations being canceled and rebooked and insured. But there are two parts of this, right? Jack Smith spoke very briefly, but he did talk about not just his desire for a speedy trial, but the defendant's right to a speedy trial. On the other hand, what Glenn is reporting on and has reported on is Trump fairly successfully using legal delays to his benefit. Tell me where the rubber meets the road there.
Well, the scheduling order that became public this morning that the judge had signed is a pretty standard scheduling order, because by virtue of the Speedy Trial Act, which is part of our U.S. code, separate from the speedy trial right that's in the Constitution, the code says, you know, in the ordinary case, you'll be tried within 70 days of your indictment, right? So the judge was kind of looking at the calendar and picking the date that would get within that. Now, then there are all kinds of exceptions to that Speedy Trial Act, and exceptions where the judge can grant extensions or continuances. And the judge in her order specifically anticipated those. She has a paragraph 10, that talks about the potential for continuances that would be adjudged under a standard of the ends of justice would be served by an extension. And she specifically references the need really to have Trump's attorneys cleared and to comply with the Classified Information Procedures Act, or CIPA. And those are the procedures by which the government and a defendant can litigate in front of the trial judge issues related to the admission of classified information in a public trial and how that can be done in a way that is both consistent with preserving national security interests and consistent with respecting a defendant's due process rights, constitutional due process rights. And those proceedings, I will tell you in my own experience, they take time because we're talking about having to first get counsel cleared so that they can even see the discovery, meaning even see the documents that the government intends to use in its case in chief, classified documents that they will only be able to review in a sensitive compartmented information facility or SCIF inside the courthouse. So they can't take them home. They can't take them on the train with them. They'll have to go to the courthouse to review them. They will then have a right to see maybe some other documents that they think might be relevant to their defenses. And then they'll hash out with the government and the judge what can be admitted, and are there ways to be admitted that protect national security using things called substitutions or summaries. So maybe sometimes you don't actually put the actual document in evidence, you put an agreed upon summary that respects the defendant's rights to make a defense while protecting national security. So I could go on and on about this and your viewers would be bleary-eyed. The point is, though, those things take time. And those motions take time to litigate. So I don't expect this going to trial August 14th. In fact, I laughed out loud when I saw the scheduling order. I do appreciate that the judge is trying to, do this by the book, treat this like any other case, put out a standard scheduling order. But that date won't be able to hold.
Mary, there's something else going on. I don't imagine Jack Smith and his prosecutors need any legal advice from Trump's former allies like Bill Barr and Chris Christie, but they keep getting on television and knocking down his stated defenses and expected defenses. Let me show you Chris Christie's latest smackdown of Trump's attempt at a legal defense from this morning on CBS.
Last night, he said the reason he didn't give the documents back was because he's just so very busy and he didn't have time to respond to a grand jury subpoena because he needed to get his golf shirts and pants out of the box. I mean, does anybody in America believe this?
Apparently so, right?
Well,
yes.
Look, I think the problem is going to be for him over time is that people are just not going to buy it. And when you think about how many days of golf he's played since he left office, maybe he could have skipped a couple of rounds of golf and gone through the boxes to respond to a subpoena from a grand jury. Look, the problem for Donald Trump in all of this is his own conduct. He's his own worst enemy. None of this would have happened to him or to the country if he had just returned the documents. It appears to me last night, as a former prosecutor, that he admitted obstruction of justice on the air last night to Bret Baier. I can tell you this, his lawyers this morning are jumping out of whatever window they're near.
So, Mary, again, he's a candidate for president, but he's a former prosecutor, former advisor and ally to Donald Trump. He was one who understood the lethal threat that both Robert Mueller and Michael Cohen represented to Donald Trump while he was president because of the power of the federal government when it is investigating and prosecuting someone. What about his comments that even the defenses that he's trotting out for ostensibly political purposes, as Glenn Thrush points out, are not going to wear well? They're nonsensical.
Well, I mean, Chris Christie, of course, has his own political reasons for making these statements, but he was a prosecutor and he can see what any former prosecutor and plenty of people who have just been following the news can see, which is that Donald Trump, he cannot keep a story straight, right? He constantly is putting up different possible defenses. He makes inconsistent statements, even in the course of one interview. And he makes admissions all the time. And anything he says that is an admission against his own interests, such as, yeah, I took all those boxes, all that information was mine, all the documents and other items, clothes and shoes and what have you, and those boxes was mine. That's an admission that he took boxes knowing that there were things in them that, at least some were not clothes and shoes. Some were classified documents. And so those things are admissible at trial. You said at your opening, all the things he says every day, can those be used? Yes, absolutely, they can be used. He can try to take the stand and explain why that was hyperbole or he didn't mean what he said, but then that means taking the stand and digging him, digging the grave a little bit deeper. I mean, he is really what you would call, as a defense attorney, I think, just kind of a nightmare client, because he cannot be relied on to sort of not talk about his case. And when he does talk about it, what he says is not really sensical when it comes to a legal defense. And is, even if there were some, statements he makes that ever could be the basis for a defense, he'll undercut them in the next sentence or the next day when he's on TV or giving a speech. So I do, feel the littlest bit sorry for those attorneys.